Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about understanding why, when it comes to training, it comes to coaching, it comes to training yourself, that exceptions to the rule are not really that important in the grand scheme of things, and they do not change the basic rules. And I'll give you guys some examples because I deal with these pretty often in the comment section and stuff, such as when I made a video a while back explaining the health benefits of strength training, right? Explaining the health benefits of strength training. And I went into a lot of detail, and a lot of that's very, very heavily backed by science, by medical research, all this other stuff. And sure enough, what happens? You say something like that, and someone comes in and gives an example of someone who they feel that the strength training has made them unhealthy. Now, the ironic part is that the training itself had nothing to do with it. But it's that exception to the rule. So when we say strength training helps with cardiovascular disease, it reduces diabetes rates, osteoporosis rates, Alzheimer's rates, all these other things, right? We discuss these things. That's well understood. And if you understand that rule, and that's the advice you give to people, people are going to be healthier in general. And the person's claim was, well, Hathor, aka the mountain, isn't healthy and he strength trains. That guy's over 400 pounds and uses tons of drugs and has a high body fat, blah, blah, blah. He goes down the list. And I want people to think about the idiocracy of that statement. The sheer idiocracy of it. Is that man 400 and something pounds because he strength trains, or is he 400 and something pounds because he eats over 10,000 calories a day? Okay. And I'm not saying he lift the same weights, but don't you think he could still strength train if he weighed less? In other words, if the man only ate 4,000 calories a day and weighed 200 and something pounds instead of 400 and something, and he strength trained, and he trained just as hard, but didn't eat 10,000 plus calories a day and didn't use a bunch of drugs, would he be much, much, much healthier? Yes. He wouldn't be as strong, of course, but he would be healthier. But the training is still kind of the same. Right? If he just strength trained and didn't do these other things. Right? Do you see where we're going with this? But by that same token, some common sense would tell you, what if he did those other things and didn't strength train? Wouldn't the health effects be even worse? Because strength training offsets a lot of those negatives. Right? Being 400 pounds isn't healthy. But if you train regularly and exercise, it's slightly less unhealthy. Doesn't completely remove the negatives of being 400 and something pounds. Right? It doesn't remove them completely. It helps them better. You're still healthier than if you didn't train. Same thing. We could argue that if the guy used the same amount of whatever substances he's putting into his body, what if he didn't exercise at all and didn't strength train and was sedentary and put all those things into his body? Don't you think that would be even worse for his health? The strength training is still making him healthier in spite of the two other lifestyle factors. Now, people say, but he uses those to get stronger. Okay, but that's not strength training. That's adding other variables in on top of your strength training. It's not strength training. There's nothing unhealthy about the man going in and training to be stronger. That will generally improve your health. Other exceptions I can talk about for a lot of people, the deficit deadlift can be a perfectly good exercise, perfectly reasonable exercise. But what about the guy with really short arms? Well, okay, maybe not as safe for him. It's not giving him the same angles, but it's because he's already at a deficit deadlift. Right, that's the exception to the rule, but why is that exception to the rule there? Well, look at it a different way. The rule is there because it increases the range of motion. Right? It increases the range of motion the same way that having shorter arms does. And I mean literally the same way shorter arms does. that person's not really the exception to the rule, are they? Because why do we deficit deadlift? Again, we deficit deadlift to reduce the range of motion to get to where they are. Well, they're already there. They've already reduced the range of motion. They are already kind of doing a deficit deadlift. They're just doing it through arm length instead of standing on stuff. The end result, though, is the same movement, the same joint angle. The people say, but they're still not able to, they might not be able to safely do any further deficit. Well, they might actually be able to. And if they could, they'd still get some of the benefits from that small 1-inch deficit, wouldn't they? They'd still get it. They're not really a true exception to rule, but when you say that, people say, well, that guy, so that rule is bad. No, that rule is great. Rule is great. You just want to talk about like wide stance box squats are an amazing exercise with tons of benefits. But Jason, I know a guy who only has one leg. He can't do those. And I'd say, well, that might be true. They're more difficult to do, especially the wide stance. Yeah, only one leg. The artificial leg. I guess unless you're Casey Mitchum. You know, he might be the exception to the rule that puts him back to the rule. But here's my point. People think that they're clever by coming up with exceptions to the rule because they think that means that the rule isn't good. Okay. You do understand there's exceptions to pretty much any rule that you come up with for anything in any endeavor in life, right? There's always going to be an exception to the rule. But there's still good advice. That doesn't make the advice itself not generally good. All right, and here's another thing. What if there's a lot of exceptions to a good rule? How about we just call them guidelines? Because that's what I like to do, because you guys will hear me say that. Well, this rule I give you is a guideline. And a good coach and a good athlete knows when to disregard the guideline and break it. Okay? We know when to do so. So what if it turns out that 20% of people are the exception to that rule? Well, the exception to that guideline. Okay. But it's still good advice 80% of the time. I'd say that's a pretty good rule. But it's a guideline. It's a good guideline to follow. All right? We have good guidelines to follow. I'll give you guys tons of them that people want to argue against. Most people, if they train for it, meaning they actually do the lift for a while to build the musculature, can probably squat more weight with a wide stance than they can a narrow one. Okay? Right? It's a good guideline. There might be a few people whose hip structure doesn't allow for it. Okay, they're there. They are out there. Okay, fine, fair enough. It doesn't make it less true, though. Most people will. We could argue that most people, they have the mobility and stuff, would benefit from using deficit deadlifts for hypertrophy and improving their raw deadlift. Okay. Good guideline. Doesn't matter. Strength training is very good for your health and longevity. And we've got plenty of scientific evidence to support that one. Very, very large amounts of it. So here's the point. These good guidelines are still useful. And it doesn't matter if I'm the exception to them, does it? I break some of my own guidelines, don't I? Doesn't mean that this is best for you two. Probably won't be. It's probably still a good guideline for you even if I'm the exception, because I am the exception on some of these things. I have really long arms relative to my height and structure. So I've got some bizarre leverages. Right? I'm a very, very advanced lifter. That's going to make me exception to a hell of a lot of guidelines that I give you guys. I'm in my 40s. That's going to change some guidelines for things like recovery and tendons. Tons of other ones. I live a pretty stress-free life. That's going to affect my recovery. I have 2 home businesses that are businesses that I'm passionate about. I don't have the same life stressors other people have. I have different sets of stressors, but it's just they're generally below average. It gives me an advantage, doesn't it? Certain things. Makes me an exception. Doesn't mean that those guidelines aren't still good for other people. And that's true of any guideline. Just because there are exceptions, even if they're relatively common exceptions, could be 10, 20% of people. The guideline still is good for most people. It's a good guideline. Alright guys, well that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.